Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you guys today and talk you through the issue of human food byproducts used in feed and pet food. And Ollie kind of asked me to do a combination of things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the industry, how we use these ingredients, and then go into some regulations. And then we'll also talk about the how you need definitions, how you go into practice about putting these ingredients into the feed and pet food supply. So just a little bit about the American Feed Industry Association. So we're a trade association. We have been in existence since 1909, and we're here to represent the business of animal food and feed and pet food on the legislative and regulatory interests for the entire feed industry. So we have just about 680 domestic and international members, and we cover the full gamut of the feed industry, from the feed and pet food manufacturers, the ingredient suppliers, the associations that from the state perspective, we have the National Renderers Association, the North American Renderers Association, I can't get used to their new name, pharmaceutical, equipment manufacturers. So they're all members of ours, and we represent their interests on the state and federal basis. That's just a little bit about who and what we are from an association. So one of the things that you'll see is our industry is very dependent upon all of agriculture. So not only are we looking at the health of the livestock and poultry industries that we feed, but we are also dependent upon agriculture for the products that we turn into feed and pet food. And so we've done a couple of studies in the last couple of years through our public charity, the Institute for Feed Education and Research. And I'm going to walk you through some of that data that shows you our contribution to the economy and then how we use these ingredients. So the first study was one that was focused in on feed manufacturing. And so this was done in 2016. And we know we have about 5,715 feed mills in the United States. And those feed mills are manufacturing 236 million tons of feed across the livestock, poultry, and aquaculture. So we've got 9 different species that we looked at for this study back in 2016. We then did another study that we just released in last month with, again, our public charity iFeeder, but then also the Foundation for the North American Renderers Association and with the Pet Food Institute. And so this study looked at the contribution of pet food to the US economy, and then also the ingredients that are used, and then how that plays back through the US economy. So for pet food, we've got 519 pet food facilities that are registered facilities with the Food and Drug Administration. And those facilities produced 9.8 million tons of dog and cat food in 2018 and 2019. So it's a split year that we looked at for that study. To flip back to the livestock side, so again, I mentioned what we analyzed was those 9 species. We had different industry experts, and we found that we've got 40, roughly over 40 commonly used ingredients in feed. The study goes into way more detail, but here are the top 5 ingredients that were used. And you'll notice that starting to get into, how we utilize some of these byproducts, but here, corn was our #1 across all of these species. Soybean meal, then we get into DDGs. DDGs are not, as Marla first indicated, not necessarily a byproduct of food production, right? But we do from the industrial ethanol production. So we are getting byproducts from several different sources. Then the wheat products and animal proteins. But when you look broadly, so more than those top 5, you can see that we've got over here on the left-hand side, we start to get into bakery meal, corn gluten feed, cottonseed meal, which comes from our cotton producers, wheat midds. Several of them are significant in the amount of tonnage that we use in manufacturing our livestock, poultry, and aquaculture feeds. And when we flip back to pet foods, so here's the top 7 ingredients that we found in that are used in pet food. And this was looking at the ingredient listings, and we did some categorization when we pulled these together. But the difference from pet food and feed, we found 500 different ingredients in our pet foods. And this is a word cloud that's based off of not volume, but their how many times they showed up on the ingredient statement. As you know, the pet food label is by order of predominance, so it's going to be just by number of showings on that label, not necessarily by weight. But again, we've got several ingredients on here that again go to either directly human foods, right? We can see carrots, we can see eggs on here, apples, blueberries, potatoes. Then we've got others that can be from the byproducts from the human food processing, fish broth. We got poultry broth. We've got where we got the tomato pummices, dried carrots, other ones. So we definitely have a huge variety of ingredients. And I think it shows up even more on the pet food side for the creativity that has been put into that channel lately in using different ingredients. So that shows you how they've been used and how they are being used. And then we'll flip into a little bit more onto the regulatory side of things. So Marla did kick it off earlier talking about the Food Safety Modernization Act requirements. And I'll just reiterate real quickly, since that was several hours ago. If it is a human food facility that's registered with FDA and meeting, that's manufacturing these animal food byproducts, they must meet those human food regulations in 21 CFR 175, and they must not then further process the animal food ingredient. As she said, if you are further processing that, then that kicks in further regulations. So if you meet those 2 requirements, you're not further processing, you're already meeting the human food requirements, then yes, there are limited requirements for what needs to be done for that animal food ingredient, and mostly holding that ingredient to prevent contamination. That is one of the main things that FDA makes sure to point out. You've got to have proper containers. You've got to make sure they're properly labeled, that there's no way that trash can be thrown into those containers. Marla also pointed out the guidance for industry number 239. So that is the place to go to give you all of the information that you need and your step-by-step requirements to meet the Food Safety Modernization Act. So I'm going to transition into the importance of the ingredient itself. So ingredients across animal food have to be approved, right? So state law requires that, federal law requires that our ingredients have gone through a review process and are safe for their intended use. And we've got a couple of different ways that that can be done. The way that the state laws are written is based off of the AFCO model bill. So the Association of American Feed Control Officials has a model bill and regulations, and the states are all based off of that. And they require those ingredients to be approved food additives, generally recognized as safe, and defined by AFCO. There's also provisions that allow your states to define ingredients by the commissioner or director of the Department of Agriculture. And I know Washington State is one of those that has their set list of ingredients that they define that are more applicable to products manufactured in Washington State and used in Washington State. And that's an example of how a state can go and make things applicable for their industry as well. So knowing that ingredients have to be approved, the first place a lot of people go to look for those ingredients is in the AFCO official publication. And I know you've got a presentation later on the online database of ingredients, and that is an excellent tool for companies to search to see if the ingredient is already approved. If you don't have access to the official publication, I encourage you to get it. It's the online database comes with that. You really need the official publication to be able to see those improved ingredients and to know what the labeling requirements are and other items in that official publication. So I just wanted to call out a couple of the different sections in the ingredient definitions section for note for you. AFCO in the last several years has put some emphasis on the human food byproducts area and realized that we didn't have a lot of those ingredients defined. And as the whole topic of sustainability and food waste have come to play more, that we knew that there were going to be different ingredients that could be coming forward, and wanted to find a way to really categorize them and to make sure that they were defined if they already were not defined. So one of the things is they created a section in the AFCO definitions section just for human food byproducts. So some of those are new definitions, but other ones, they were in different parts of the definition section. So they moved them into one area so you could easily find them and look through the different definitions. One item to note for you at the beginning of that section, before you get into the individual definitions, there is a note at the beginning. And this comes back to the fundamental basis of all ingredients offered into the marketplace need to be safe for their intended use. So this note, I wrote it last night while I was working on my presentation. It's just stated there, so all ingredients must be feed grade. They have to at least be feed grade in order to be used. The firm should perform a safety assessment of the materials that may be included in the offered feed ingredient at the maximum use level. So you must be able to have that safety assessment to show that they're at the maximum use level, it's safe for the intended animal species, and it's safe for the meat, milk, and eggs from the animals consuming those ingredients. So you're looking at the safety to the animal, but also to the safety of you and I consuming those meat, milk, or egg products from the animals. So that safety assessment needs to be archived in your files and provided to state or federal regulators upon request. And so this is for those companies that are going to be distributing that human food byproduct ingredient into the marketplace. You need to have that safety assessment done. There are lots of ingredients in that section. Some of them are very old and go back quite some years. Cereal food fines, for example, goes back to 1957. We've got pasta product in there. Some of the newer ones, we've got food processing waste, restaurant waste. Recovered retail food is one of the newer ingredients. And that's one that really came about because of the whole sustainability and food waste topic. Section 60 then is miscellaneous products. And that, again, so some of those ingredients in Section 40 came over from Section 60, but there still are some products over in Section 60 that may be relevant. So if you don't find it in Section 40, that doesn't mean it's not there. Just look a little bit harder, and it may be over in Section 60 as well. The index is good. The online database of ingredients, that's where you want to probably do your search if you're not very familiar with the AFCOOP. Then I wanted to just bring up some of the new things happening within AFCO. So we talk a lot about when you are putting an ingredient on your label, you've probably heard the words common or usual, right? The common or usual name for that ingredient. Well, there's a federal definition for that, but there wasn't a definition or feed term in AFCO. And so these two terms here, the common or usual name or common food, those are working their way through the AFCO process and they've gone through the committee process and have to go through the final membership vote coming up at their next meeting. So I just wanted to put those up there for you. The common food definition is one that, FDA and AFCO have forever, decades, have said that it's impossible to define every possible food that is out there, especially some of those common foods. And that's always been something vernacular. I've been in this job now for 10 years. It's been said, I have my interpretation of what common or usual meant and what common food meant, but it was my interpretation. And Ollie and the state regulators may have had their own interpretation. So this now provides us with a common basis to move forward and some common understanding. So especially as you're doing business across state lines, this should help in that ease of labeling and allowance for different ingredients. The key here for the common food, so it's a common food that's commercially available, suitable for use in animal foods, but are not defined, including but not limited to certain whole seeds, vegetables, or fruits. They may be common foods, may include common human foods that are known to be safe for their intended use in animal food. And then the manufacturers are again responsible for determining that it is safe and has that utility for the intended use prior to putting that product into market. The other aspect I can talk about here is labeling. So I don't have a separate slide on it, but the products, the ingredients from human food bioprocessing also need to be properly labeled. And so those requirements, again, you can find the model in the AFCO official publication. You'll see what Washington State requires in your state regulations. There are also federal regulations as well, but the harmonization across those three should be pretty close. And so you've got to properly name the product with a common or usual name. You've got to include your ingredient statement, any guarantees, and then your intended use of the product. So that does need to also be done. And just to wrap up, with the coronavirus situation, I think we've all learned how interconnected agriculture is. We always knew that we were one body, one voice, but I think it's something that this pandemic has really stressed. And now as we are seeing the impact on certain segments of our supply chain and how it's being felt in other parts, it's really bringing this to light for other parts of the industry. So we at the American Feed Industry Association, our first point of reference was making sure that the animal food manufacturers, processors, package, retail, transport, all of that were deemed as essential business, and you guys could continue to operate so we could feed our livestock, poultry, companion animals, making sure your employees were safe, but then also making sure that the supply chain was intact and able to operate. And so there have been some spotty or localized shortages of certain ingredients. but we're starting to see some more widespread issues. And it all relates to, again, to that interconnected nature of our supply chain. So, for example, with food service being slow and not having as much bakery products out there, we're not milling as much flour, and therefore we are short on wheat mids. In some areas, that's affecting more than others, just depending upon your flour milling in that area and where the end product was going. With the capacity for slaughter operations and meat processing, and with the shutterings that happened, we had at first localized shortages of blood meal, meat and bone meal, poultry byproducts. That's becoming more widespread now. And so we worked closely to try to, if animals were being depopulated, to make sure that they could still get into the rendered supply. So we didn't have a complete void in those ingredients. Again, with the ethanol situation, with not as many of us driving every day, there's not as much demand for ethanol. So we've had shutterings of ethanol facilities, which means that we don't have distillers' dry grains to go into our livestock feed. So all of that means that we're looking for substitutions, and those substitutions are happening, but it's putting pressure on the ingredients that we are substituting as well. So we're keeping an eye on that to make sure that we don't then create further shortages on down the supply chain. But you're starting, I just pulled a couple of headlines that are out there. I think people are starting to realize that food is a national security issue, that our supply chain maybe isn't broken, but it definitely is interconnected, and ramifications can be felt throughout agriculture, not just back to the farmer. So I will stop there and take any questions.
Well, thank you for sharing this information, Ms. Wilkinson. And definitely what you have been talking about with these substitution ingredients happening currently. Um, I hope that, if ever something like this happens again, that we are prepared because we're experiencing all of this now. I see a couple of questions right now. Is there a database for hazardous ingredients by species? For example, copper with sheep.
So we have, there are a couple of tools that are out there. One of the things that between the National Grain and Feed Foundation and our AFIA Foundation through iFeeder, we worked on a literature search that looked at hazards in the feed and pet food supply that could be used for your hazard analysis. So that is available to our members of the two associations. There are other, I know, lists that have been up there. FDA used to have a list, they've taken it down. But if you look through the preamble of the FSMA regulations, they have listed a couple of examples. And Dave Fairfield, I don't know if you want to chime in with anything else on that question.
No, Leah, I think you covered it. The database that our two organizations worked to put together lists hazards that were identified in different ingredients based on a literature search. So I think it's a useful tool if folks have access to it. Thank you.
Okay, and we also have another question. Who conducts a safety assessment for the foods? Does a firm have to hire an independent consultant to confirm the safety?
So I'm going to assume you're talking about the ingredient itself, right? So
That's what I'm going to assume as well.
yeah. So you can do that internally. You could work with other experts. You're going to need to base that off of some sort of studies or knowledge of the ingredient and its interaction with with the animals that you are going to be feeding it to. Part of that is what would be needed to get the ingredient approved, right? So there is safety assessments that have to be done in order to meet the requirements for either getting it through an approval process with the Food and Drug Administration or through an AFCO ingredient review. But so the company that does that to get the definition, they will go through that. And then as you are putting that product onto market, you just need to be making sure. So it's maybe like a little mini hazard analysis, just making sure that the processes you have in place is not unintentionally creating a hazard for that product going out the door to animal food.
Okay. Do we have any other questions at this point? A lot of information to process, I'm sure. And if any do come in, we will certainly keep those and ask those directly to you so you can help us answer them when we create that Q&A for the participants and send them an email after this training.
No problem.